I'm super stoked because while I was in Texas, I picked up a book called The Rag and Bone Shop by Robert Cormier. And I read the book in the space of a couple days, and I'm super stoked to do a book review of this specific book. Now, I don't know what to think about this book. To me, it didn't feel as maybe hopeful as The Chocolate War, which is strange to say, because The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier is not a very, I would describe, optimistic book either. But at least comparing them, it seems that this book, which is the last book that Robert Cormier wrote, or at least, yeah, I understand this as being the last book that he wrote, that basically this book is even darker. I didn't think it could go even darker than Robert Cormier's Chocolate War, but it seems like this book is dark, and I will tell you why. The basic premise of the story is that there is a character. His character's name is Jason, and he was the last person to see a girl who was brutally murdered, and that's already very difficult to have to digest, even though it is fiction. But the first part, goes into the character development of Jason, and Jason seems to be like any regular kid. Maybe he has a hard time fitting in, but he likes reading, he likes watching science fiction movies, he likes reading Stephen King, and he is just enjoying his time in school. And even though he's not really very close with anyone, his parents seem very distant from him, he still nonetheless is just enjoying his life as a kid. But there's an undercurrent in the first part of the book which goes into the idea that maybe Jason is different from other kids. He tends to be more introverted and quiet, and it is brought up later in a criticism that, as taboo as this is, that even though he was a kid himself, he was hanging out with younger kids, specifically with the individual who was killed, the girl. And that will come up later as well, which I think is important to mention. And then so is the seemingly innocent detail of him getting in a fight with someone when he was trying to defend someone. To make a long story short, Jason was fighting a bully whose name was Bobo, and he was literally sexually assaulting another individual, a girl. And so that was exactly why the fight happened in the first place, because Jason recognized that this character was a bully. And so it's these details which you can imagine become very complicated later on. Now let's get to the second part of the book, which goes into a very long sequence of an interrogation and of dialogue, where Jason is brought in for questioning. And the very tragic thing about this, I'll just say this outright, is that Jason is in the fashion of the way that people treat the characters in Robert Cormier's book. He is completely bulldozed. So by that I mean that the interrogation the entire time hangs on the assumption that Jason is guilty. And so even though the person who is interrogating him understands later on that during the interrogation that Jason is innocent, it doesn't matter, because all this interrogator cares about is that Jason is guilty, and there's no way around that. And so through a way of twisting the words that Jason says, such as the fact that he does like Stephen King, which means that he likes violent books, which means that he likes violence, even though he just watches science fiction, which many people watch science fiction, the fact that it wasn't okay that Jason was hanging out with the girl sometimes that was killed because he was older and he shouldn't have been with a younger kid, and then just the fact that they thought that he was guilty because he was the last person to see the girl alive. And so in the third act of the book, which I think is probably the most painful to read, even though that might not even be true, because I do think the interrogation was also very brutal to read as well, because this interrogator destroys Jason, that you realize that Jason has a breakdown because he confessed to something that he didn't do. He has a breakdown, a mental breakdown, where he's on medications, where he's not doing well, where he's basically lost in his head, where he is just completely defunct at this point, because that is how much he has been broken down. And so the third part is very tragic, because even though they do recognize that Jason was innocent of the crime, because someone else confessed to the crime later on, it doesn't matter, because this character Jason is destroyed. And so this is probably the biggest spoiler, which is that Jason ends up at the very end of the book going over something that the interrogator said to him, which was, "You would hurt a bully, wouldn't you?" Something of that nature. And he says in his mind, "Yes, I would, because it wasn't okay what he did." And in a very disturbing description, he thinks about Bobo, which is the bully, knows where to meet him, picks up a butcher knife, and then that's how the book ends. Now, this book is very difficult for me to process and digest. I am a little less convinced of the ending, because even though I know that this character was broken down, literally had a mental breakdown because of the way that he was treated, a way that was going to destroy his life forever from that point on, I wasn't sure that it was completely realistic to have this character snap so much that he became violent himself, or at least that's the implication. I don't know how to feel about that, because while knowing Robert Cormier's work, which is that people that get bulldozed, whether they're innocent or not, they become fundamentally altered in a very dark way by the society in which they live. And so what ends up happening is that they break in some way, or they're punished in some way, and they're never the same again. And so if the theme that this writer Cormier is getting at, knowing his work as well, maybe he's getting at the point that this character never was truly innocent, or even something more horrifying, which is that people can be broken down in such a way that they can become completely suggestible and open to suggestion, to where they do things that they wouldn't have normally done because they've been broken. That's very possible, and so if that is the case, that's a very strong social commentary. But the part where I struggle with it is thinking about that horrible sequence where the interrogation is going on, and the way that every word of this kid, because he's a middle schooler, he's in 8th grade, Jason is in 8th grade, he doesn't have it in him to commit a murder the way that they thought that he did. And the way that he gets manipulated and gaslighted and defeated and destroyed is really heartbreaking, because I personally think the book would have been stronger if the character just had a breakdown, if Jason just broke down but didn't do anything from that, maybe just detached from society and became separated to where he was sick for the rest of his life. So I'm not sure that it's as convincing and as powerful to have him be someone who would be willing to kill a bully, or at least that's the implication with grabbing the butcher knife. But the thing that I think is so powerful is you can't ignore what happened in the interview, where it seems as though this character has been defeated. He breaks so much under the pressure of something that was unfair and of this constant pushing towards him as being guilty of something he didn't do, that he breaks down. His voice broke when he finally confessed, because he was done. He was destroyed. And so, keeping in mind how powerful of a narrative device that is to have this interrogation be so wrong to destroy an innocent kid's life, that is heartbreaking. And one of the things that I think is powerful that comes from this book is just the recognition that people's actions have consequences, that society can break us down, that this twisted way of living and thinking that we can do whatever we want to people doesn't have consequences. And that to me is why it is so powerful, because I've said it already, but I find the interrogation, that whole part, to be just plain tragic, heartbreaking, and sad. I would hope that the world wouldn't always operate that way, but obviously Cormier has a degree of gritty realism, even though he is writing books for young adults. He has a gritty realism which I think captures the idea that this is definitely possible, and that it probably does happen in some capacity. People are broken by the system, they're broken by the world that they live in, and as usual with Robert Cormier's work, I would say that he hit a nerve with me. His writing connected with me, and that's why I wanted to do a review of this book. And so my ultimate conclusion then is I don't really know what to think about it, just that it's heartbreaking and that it doesn't seem fair, but that this is what happens in life, or at least this is something that is possible in life with the way that we treat people and the way that the systems get the best of us. And so, while I wouldn't say that this is my favorite book by Cormier that I've read, I would say that it is definitely very thought-provoking. I would say that it is tragic. I would say that it is beautifully written. And I would say that because of the straightforward way in which the book is written, it makes the book that much more convincing. It's a very short read. It is only roughly 150 pages. And so I did want to say, just as a side note, well, actually an important note, I shouldn't say side note, it's an important note, which is that The phrase rag and bone shop comes from Yeats, and it comes from one of his poems. I don't remember the exact title of the poem, I will need to look it up, but the line is, "I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." And a rag and bone shop is basically the idea of a place where things are thrown away that people don't want. And so I always thought that that was a powerful line. And so I think it definitely is a very interesting line to keep in mind as you puzzle over this book by Robert Cormier. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you will check out my other videos on my channel. I'm super stoked that I got to share this review of this book with you and that I got to read this book. And so yeah, I'm Phoenix, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time.